sometime in the next couple decades, the scientific community is going to have to admit, I think, that genetic mutations are not strictly random. They are directed towards the production of adaptive phenotypes. Not that most mutations are actually adaptive, but more are than would be predicted by chance. The observational data supporting this is still mounting, so it's unlikely that the average biologist will recognize this anytime soon. But you could look at the reconstructed speciation rates from the fossil record or some experimental data from E. coli mutating to adapt to different environments. And the timelines there don't quite add up to the neo Darwinian predictions. That is, under the assumption of random mutation. If you want to learn more about this concept of directed evolution, you could look at, Sheldrake has a bunch of stuff on it, Rupert Sheldrake, but also Gunter Beckley, Gunterbechly. The mechanism explaining how this could take place, aside from morphic resonance, has been put forward as a kind of quantum computation that takes place within DNA. The DNA molecule, it's recently been found, is held together partly through quantum entanglement. And mutations are actually a direct result of quantum mechanical effects, specifically proton tunneling occurring in the hydrogen atoms, which bond the two halves of the double helix. This basically sets up the potential for some kind of quantum computation. Remember, David Deutsch, the inventor of the concept of quantum computation, conceives of this computation as taking advantage of the computational resources of parallel universes. So the particles in the quantum computer in your space-time dimension have counterparts in nearby parallel dimensions, and they are entangled with those counterparts. The whole idea of entanglement is that two different things or more share a common quantum state, which means they share the same distribution of potential measurement outcomes, which means when the frequency of the measurement outcome of one element of the entangled system increases, that influences the frequency of measurement outcomes of the other aspect of the system. They are non-locally entangled, and in Deutsch's view, across dimensions, they are entangled. It might be helpful to look at my interpretation, the perennialist interpretation of quantum mechanics. I have a video up by that title on this channel that you could look at. But the way that I conceive of it, quantum entanglement and superposition generally takes place whenever there is a fundamental epistemological ambiguity between you as an observer and the potential physical environments you might find yourself in. There is not a one-to-one mapping of mind to world. There is a one-to-many mapping because consciousness is fuzzy. The scope of our causal access to physical reality is fuzzy. It doesn't precisely define everything else in the world. There are many things in the world that could be in any number of different states or positions without impinging upon or impacting the state of us as observers. So all of those systems, the state of which are indeterminate with respect to our identity, which are ambiguous, don't exist in one definite state. They do actually exist in superposition. And that superposition is over many parallel dimensions, which are consistent with our observation. And once measurement occurs, many of those branches will no longer be consistent, and it'll be refined to only the one universe. And then as that particle moves on, or that system moves on, it once again widens into a wave function and evolves according to Schrodinger's equation. That's more or less how I see it working. In my view, this would take place beyond the scale of quantum mechanical systems. It should actually take place at very large scale systems beyond the scope of our current observation. It should also take place in eidetic space, meaning the kinds of propositions that one could truthfully ascribe to systems here on Earth. Sometimes there is epistemological ambiguity there, and even those propositions, those high meta-level things, would exist in superposition. High-level sociological effects would be influenced by superposition. The behavior of economies, stock markets, things along those lines, the thoughts in another person's mind may well exist in superposition relative to yourself, meaning someone could consistently be thinking any number of things and be consistent with all of our other data. So going back to the case of DNA, the upshot of this is that since the frequency of measurement outcomes of one element of an entangled system impacts the probability of measurement of the other, if there's going to be a mutation, and mutation X results in 1,000 surviving organisms in different parallel universes, and mutation Y only results in 3 surviving organisms, because the system is entangled, the way it's entangled, the actual measurement will skew towards mutation X. It's as if DNA could look forward in time and see how this mutation would in practice pan out, and then go for that mutation that would be more adaptive. They're not actually looking into the future of this space-time dimension. They're looking at parallel universes where that same entangled system exists. The implications, if this is true, are very wide. It applies to our concepts of ethics, politics, and crucially of identity. Usually when we think of our lineage or our bloodline, we think of our ancestors to ourselves, to our descendants. But that's not the whole picture, because the direction of our evolution is shaped by the general type that is pandimensional. It's across many dimensions. And there's feedback from those dimensions onto ourselves. So the direction of our evolution is not just determined by what we do with our genes here, what we do with our actions here. All of that, our individual stuff, is shaped by the group that we're a member of. And the group that we're a member of subtly changes as our attributes change. So the issue of fitness has to be reconceptualized in this kind of quantum evolution picture, away from adaptation to the local environment towards an approximation of maximally coherent interdimensional structures. So we have to find those structures that are coherent and assimilate to them. And the attributes that those structures can coherently take on are interdependently related. That's one of the implications of my view of quantum mechanics, that basically whenever a substance, an individual, has a property, the other properties that that individual takes on will be skewed towards the other properties that other substances with property A has. So, to give an example, I have blue eyes. The other attributes that I have will be shifted towards the other attributes that blue-eyed people tend to have. That's just basically a simple tautological statistical truth, like saying you're more likely to go to the bank when it's crowded than when it's not crowded. That is statistically true, because a crowd is more people, and so if you were going to calculate the probability of a given person being in the bank, they're more likely to be there when there are a bunch of people there than when there's only 2 people there. So it's tautologically true at that level. But because of the way that probability and actuality are distributed in reality, because of that, there are certain properties that we have that are not currently identified, that are not currently definite. They are in superposition. And the definite properties that we have, that we take on, shape the wave function of those indefinite, ambiguous properties. I don't want to get too abstract, but Leibniz actually helps in conceptualizing this, because what I mean by a property is much larger than the common sense notion of a property. Leibniz has a few really good axioms. One is the identity of indiscernibles. Another is the analyticity of predication. That is predication in terms of a subject-predicate relation. So in Leibniz's view, predicates are always analytical and never synthetic. A synthetic predicate would be adding something onto the subject. If a predication is a true predication for Leibniz, it is analytical. You are identifying a property that that thing already has. This is related to the concept of the monad, right? Where a thing is not just locally what it is. It embodies in its essence, in its identity, all of the relations it has to all other things in reality. I would qualify that by saying that we reflect the relations we could potentially have with everything with which we have causal access. But beyond a certain range of causal access, if it can't impinge upon us, we can't specify the information about our relations to literally everything else in reality. There's a range of this kind of fractal embodiment or holographic representation of our monad. But anyway, so the analyticity of predication implies that relations are properties. They're not something extra. They're not an additional thing. So you are not just what's in your skin. You are also the relationships you have with all other things. Basically, the entire observable universe. That is your true identity. And that incorporates, obviously, all of the groups that you're a member of. Voluntary groups, ethnic groups, biological identities, even kind of incidental things like properties that you have which are temporary, like I am walking. Being a member of the set of all those who are walking is one of those properties that you have at any given point in time. And harken back to the idea that when you have property A, you are gravitationally drawn towards all the other properties that substances with property A typically have. So there is this gravitational attraction. Whatever group you belong to, whatever property you have, that makes you, by virtue of that property, a member of a group, a member of a larger set that also has that property. Whenever you're a member of a higher level group, you are shifted in your development, in your biological evolution, in the evolution of your thought, your cultural evolution. Every dimension of evolution is shifted towards the other attributes that interdimensional group that you're a part of takes on average. So you can't just think of fitness in terms of the local environment. You can't think of virtue as an individual thing. Because if you're a member of a dying ethnicity, you will take on other attributes that members of dying ethnicities take on, which may be very hedonistic. Historically, that seems to be the case. So if you want to be virtuous, you have to make sure that all the groups that you're a part of lead towards virtue. That means that you have to go beyond certain groups, take yourself out of membership in certain groups. Like if you have a bad habit, stop doing that thing, because the fact that you have that habit is one of your properties, and that puts you in a group of others who have that habit, and they probably also have other bad habits that you don't want to have. So you want to intentionally be a part of only those groups that have, on aggregate, many good properties, many good attributes. And the kind of ideal that you're aspiring to there is not a local thing. You can't point to it. It's something like a Platonic form, right? That interdimensional entity, that coherent structure. it has to be regulated in a certain way. It has to take on a certain shape. The set of properties that are thrown together in that higher level thing is not arbitrary, right? Certain properties naturally go together. And so you also have to think about what consistent lines of evolution you could even go through as yourself. Like, can you be a member of a group? On the one hand, you should look at these identities in a purely philosophical sense and say, what is the value of these things? Like, what is the ethical value of these different identities that one might possibly have? And then on another level, you have to look at it pragmatically and say, okay, given what I am, what can I actually achieve? Like, you might decide that the greatest of these interdimensional groups is the seraphim, whatever. Cherubim, one of the angelic species. But you're not that. You can't be that. And so aspiring to membership in that is kind of fruitless. Instead, you have to work with what you're given and gradually shift towards participation in those groups that themselves exert that gravitational energy on you to go in a more positive direction. In the 1800s, around the time of German unification, there was a social movement called Pan-Germanism, where people with Germanic descent all over the world recognized a certain cultural affinity. Right? There was a time when the German identity could have really solidified into something truly formidable. I mean, obviously, they almost did. They almost won both world wars, depending on your perspective. And they were vastly outnumbered in both cases. But they could have gone further, right? That the philosophical currents could have crystallized. Their concept of themselves could have become more definite. But the German identity is not really amenable to that kind of crystallization, because it is by nature cooperative through competition. German tribes have always been at war with one another, and yet through this war, the whole was lifted up, the organic biological whole. The German identity was never able holistically to attain this kind of top-down mass society where a priest class dictates everything to everyone else. I mean, National Socialism arguably came close to that. The Prussian system came close to that. But never as a universal Germanic identity. What would that Germanic identity more broadly be? Is it something that we want to affirm? In my case, I'm predominantly Germanic. I have a little bit of Celtic, the rest is Germanic. Probably like 85% Germanic, maybe 15 Celtic. And I know that I am therefore drawn towards attributes that German people have. I know that they tend to look more like me. I tend to get along with these sorts of people fairly well. I tend to like the culture that these Germans have produced, but I also like culture that other cultures have produced, like the Greek philosophers or Japanese anime or whatever. So, like I said, you have to appreciate the value of these interdimensional crystalline structures independently, and then also look at, okay, what can I do knowing who I am? Well, I'm German. I am biologically shifted towards those attributes. So when I think of the kind of culture that I can be part of, the kind of ideology that I can embody, the kind of habits and rituals that I have, they have to be consistent with that German identity, or else the whole won't stay together. I need that coherent structure. I need to tune into that coherent structure that exists across a maximal number of dimensions, that is maximally true in pragmatic terms. So I have to kind of start with that concept of the German identity. Competitive, cooperative strategies, relatively egalitarian social values, a capacity for intense aggression, but also a tendency towards kind of sappiness. And like, look at the German romantic poetry, like chivalric German poetry, some of the Arthurian legends, things like that. It's extremely sappy, and they have very romanticized, idealized notion of love, but that's in a certain way a virtue. Like it's been contagious. The Germanic concept of love, in a certain respect, it actually evolves out of the courtly love tradition of Andalusian Spain, and before that, the Persian poets. But the German tradition takes it in a slightly different direction, and that concept of love is what in mass media all over the world people take to be uh, romantic love. So it's not perfect, but it's something. It's something that I'm wrapped up in inextricably, that has a gravitational influence on me. But what is that identity that I'm tapping into? There's more and less noble kinds of German identity. Germans can be total barbarians. They have been. They've been uh, thieves, murderers, rapists, just bad people, and not always attractive people. Sometimes Germans can be attractive. Sometimes they can just be thuggish. So, what is that noble German identity? What is that kind of core structure that is almost a good in itself? No biological entity is the good in itself, but there are different degrees to which we instantiate goodness. So, what is that type that I'm looking at? Is it exclusively German at that point, or is it a broader concept of nobility of being that other related cultures might have, or disparate cultures? Now, I'm not saying this is not a prescription towards ethno-nationalism or anything like that. I mean, if you really believe that the Japanese identity is the superior identity, that is the culture that you really value, that you want to assimilate yourself to, then I guess you should, marry a Japanese woman, dye your hair, move to Japan, uh, do whatever the Japanese do. But for other people, a good reference point for where you ought to start is who you explicitly belong to now, what group you explicitly belong to now. It has an influence on you, and it's not a temporary thing. In my concept of reincarnation, the properties that carry over are also relations, not just properties of your body or of your mind, but of all of the relations you have with others. Basically, there's a dichotomy between classical information and quantum information. Classical information is discrete specifications. Quantum information is the shape of the wave function, the geometry, the kind of harmonic geometry of the entailments, the possible entailments of those concrete specifications. The concrete specifications, classical information, parameterizes the evolution of quantum information. And so, because of this relationship, as classical information decreases, the scope, the spread of quantum information expands, but the overall geometry remains consistent through time, that is. There has to be a continuous evolution. So when you pick back up in consciousness, explicit information begins with a new life. All of those properties, your group memberships, too, carry on. So if you're a member of a dying ethnicity in this life, in the next life, you're more than likely going to be a member of a dying ethnicity then. All other attributes that you have with respect to these group memberships are carried with you, with some mutation, with some development. But that's why it matters what happens to that larger group. If you can influence the status of a group here, then through morphic resonance fields, you can end up directing the cumulative evolution of that type towards the ideal, towards that coherent interdimensional structure. And that should be the goal. That should be the ethical goal, because that is what allows ultimately for virtue. Because virtue isn't a one-off thing. It's not just a voluntary thing. It's a holistic thing, taking into account all of these other attributes that you have. And these other attributes have a gravitational effect on you. So the only way to be virtuous is to be a member of a virtuous society. But Obviously, genetic ties are not sufficient. You have to also have a synchronized life with others with whom you reach ideological consensus. You have to share common symbols, common language, common rituals. There's a reason why cultures which generated these elaborate religious schemes succeeded. It's due to quantum mechanical effects. It's due to these resonance effects, tapping into higher level structures, guiding our evolution here, also integrating us with each other, increasing internal coherence, and yeah, directing that towards a higher ideal. So those things are important. Your voluntary communities, your biological communities, the habits you take on, all of your attributes go into this kind of ideal type that you are assimilating yourself to more and more, ideally. It's important what type you're assimilating yourself to. Maybe first, you think about what is that ideal? What is that virtue? And then you think, what are my paths there given the group memberships that I have currently? And it's not about being creative with it and finding that pure aesthetic value. It is about discovering the true best man that you can be and the true best type that you can embody. Finding that ideal man and becoming him. And that's not an individual thing. Salvation is not individual. It is also collective. Because the collectives that you're a part of are part of your identity. They are part of your individuality. And if it's disintegrated, then the way that you evolve will be determined by other groups. There are other groups around that have understood this stuff. They're interdimensional parasitic beings that travel through different worlds, exploiting groups that can't assimilate to this ideal type. There are certain types that the parasites can't touch, the angelic types that are within the pleroma in the Gnostic terminology. They can't be touched. They have that coherent structure. They've found something truly adaptive in interdimensional terms. Whereas other groups can be steered in subtle ways through these resonance effects. These resonance effects can be built in. And what you would want to do is give every member of such a group a device in their pocket and then feed them very selectively information and control the flow of information to create particular kinds of resonance effects, create certain kinds of social habits that result in that type in this planet that you're trying to harvest the energy from, destroying itself and sacrificing all of that energy towards the greater system. Going in debt to the greater system, feeding it money, labor, the good genes that you have, feeding it into another thing, dissipating yourself, becoming lower. That's what certain entities try to do. And thinking about it only in terms of activity here on Earth is not sufficient because it's not restricted to this domain. Our evolution is not restricted to this domain. The groups matter. But also what happens to your group here on Earth matters. Matters in practical terms to your children. It matters in terms of these resonance effects and how your development goes. If people who look like you here rarely reach their potential, you're unlikely to reach your potential. You need to lift each other up if you have that common identity. Pandimensional Germanism is good enough, I suppose. I don't think it's quite there, right? Because the German identity, there's a lot of things that are positive about it, but maybe there's a higher ideal beyond it. Something beyond our concept of man that we could reach for. Then, of course, there's also the idea of higher types that you can communicate with to discover those attributes that you should take on. If you become a person who prays to higher beings, then you'll assimilate to the nature of those who pray. just be conscious of these dynamics. We think of things in much too local of terms. There's always this non-local implicate order shifting and, shaping how we develop. And if you're blind to all of that, it's going to be very difficult to navigate. But if you can see it, then no matter where you are, in what lifetime you're a part of, you can always look up and remember that coherent structure and kind of have that be a beacon to you and assimilate yourself to it, assimilate others to it, embody it, instantiate it here on Earth, and the effects will just grow from there. So, this video is all over the place. If you guys want to support the channel, help me make more content, I have a Patreon. I'm setting up a Subscribestar as well and a PayPal, so I'll leave those links in the description. If you want to join the Plato group that I'm doing right now, message me on Skype. My Skype username will be in the description. Thank you guys for listening. God bless.